heard. Welcome to the seminar of the Center for Institutional Studies and the HSE University. We are very pleased to have as our speaker tonight Israel Marques, also from HSE. He is a political science professor and a research fellow at the Institute for Industries and Market Studies in Moscow. Israel has his degrees from Columbia University. His areas of interest are political economy, development, Russian regional studies, microanalysis at the firm levels. Lately, he did quite a bit of interesting work in human capital accumulation in educational policies in Russia. And today his presentation, the title is slightly different from what was announced. It's the adoption of costly vocational education and training practices in Russia's regions. Israel, our custom is that speakers have, excuse me, 40 to 50 minutes to present the paper. And if there are any questions in the course of the presentation, then people are asked to ask these questions in the chat column of their Zoom portal. So you might want to keep an eye on what is happening in the chat. And if you're willing, you can answer these questions immediately. If you'd rather wait until the end of your presentation, then after your presentation is over, we have about 30, 40 minutes for questions and answers. So the choice is basically yours. We also keep our policy to ask all of those attending this seminar to please identify yourself in the same chat column. Well, without further ado, Israel, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Actually, so the title did not change. I apologize. I adapted my presentation a bit and did not adapt the title, apparently. But this project is a joint project with Thomas Remington, Professor Emeritus at Emory University, and our colleague Vladimir Bazavlyuk at the Institut Obrazovania. And I will just say at the outset that this paper finds itself in a bit of an unfortunate situation. So generally, I try to present work that's working papers are under review. And so we had the fortunate problem, in parentheses, that this paper was actually accepted at the European Journal of Political Economy basically 2 weeks ago. But that being said, this is part of a much larger research agenda. I'll talk a little bit about that at the end. And so all comments, criticisms, critiques are very much welcome, because it's things that we won't just keep in mind generally, but that it will actually be very helpful in the next few stages of the project. So speaking of the project, the sort of puzzle that we are trying to answer here is this very interesting phenomena that we see in Russia. So in Russia, there are these old vocational education institutions. So generally they're secondary schools, and they have been around since sort of the Soviet era. And over time, they become sort of less important. People have had more difficulties when they graduate from them finding jobs. And so one of the things that the Russian government has tried to do to encourage sort of making these things more relevant is to create public-private partnerships in which Russian firms of all sizes, large and small, will agree formally to work together with the school in costly ways. So in some cases, they're creating curricula together with the school. In some cases, they're creating qualification exams. In others, they're actually spending real money. So they're rebuilding buildings for the school. They're helping the school to hire new teachers. They're offering guaranteed jobs to the students. Now, what's particularly puzzling about this, it's generally puzzling anywhere, because this model is actually, it turns out, quite rare. But it's particularly puzzling in Russia because what we see here is firms investing together with the government, which generally is a problem in the general literature on political economy, where you don't have good institutions, political accountability, et cetera, et cetera. And it's particularly interesting in Russia because the two things that we thought that we knew about these forms of public-private partnerships and how to make them successful is that you need a strong civil society, and you need both accountability on the part of the bureaucracy to all the actors involved and on the part of politicians. And so this literature very much builds out of the German experience. And to put it very bluntly, in Russia, both of these are questions, whether we have these things. And so the development of these public-private co-partnerships are particularly interesting in Russia because from everything that we know about these public-private partnerships, particularly in education, this shouldn't exist. Now, the sort of motivation that we had is both substantive and theoretic. So substantively, the reason that we care about these public-private partnerships is that one of the ways that countries have of overcoming the sort of middle income trap, right, where they want to come to the level of development that we see in advanced industrialized countries but are unable to, is to sort of move up the value chain, to get more skilled employees who can build better, more value-laden products, right? So you want to go from building the iPhone to designing the iPhone, for example. And one of the major problems for this around the world, not just in Russia, is that it's hard to find the sort of highly skilled, highly educated employees you need to make this happen. And particularly in Russia, Russian employers are constantly pointing to this as a problem from them at very high rates, 70% in some polls, depending on when you do it. So substantively, this matters, right? It matters for economic development in Russia, particularly if it turns out that these public-private partnerships are a good way to get firms the exact skilled employees that they need. And I'll talk more about that in a minute. Theoretically, again, it's interesting because the solution to this problem of getting skilled employees is either you have a strong civil society, which enables you to build public-private partnerships between state schools and firms, or you let the market decide. But both of these, as I'll talk about in a little bit, have presuppositions, right? One is that you have a strong civil society or you have a functioning market. And again, in Russia and in the developing world more broadly, I would argue, these are questionable. And so theoretically, this is interesting. And so the argument that I'm going to make today, and that hopefully I will convince you of by the end of this talk, is that in the absence of strong civil society or these clean market mechanisms that we see, you can actually use the state as a way of creating the credible commitments necessary to make these partnerships. And the state matters both because it allows you to monitor local performance and make sure the schools are doing what they need to. But in order to get it to do that, you need to hold it accountable. And what we're going to argue in this paper is that the traditional things that you see in the West, political accountability, don't matter as much. What really matters is the ability of firms to access power structures. And here specifically, we'll talk about the legislature. Okay, so let me give you a quick backgrounder on sort of why this investment of employers into skilled employees is hard. So traditionally, in the economics literature, we think about training as an investment, but with a couple of very unique problems, right? So an investment in the sense that we're going to spend money today in order to develop something for our business tomorrow. And the unique problems that you have are that because you're not investing in equipment, but in people, and because people have free will, you always have to worry about sort of what others are going to do, the sort of behavioral aspect, right? Workers can walk away. And so it creates a commitment problem between firms, because if I as a firm decide to invest in an employee, some other firm who has made no investment in their education might be able to take them from me by simply offering them more money, right? So I pay for someone's education for 5 years. I pay them 60,000 rubles a month. Let's say this is Moscow average. Somebody else comes along 3 months later and offers them 70. So they didn't pay for any of their education. They saved all those costs. They get the employee. I'm now out my investment. It also creates commitment problems between the firm and the worker, because For the firm, generally, they want to maximize their profits and their flexibility. And so you have to convince workers that they can invest in the skills necessary to succeed at your firm without getting fired. And so you have to convince them that they have job security, that their investments will be rewarded by the market. And then finally, and most importantly for this talk, when you try to create these co-investments with the school, you need it to be the case that when you as a firm spend money on the school will actually produce the workers with the skills you need, not somebody who knows how to do Soviet-era manufacturing from the 1980s, but modern production. And as a school, you also have a problem, because if you agree to take on the new teachers, the new equipment, the new methods, all the things that a firm would like you to do, you need to be guaranteed that your students will then get jobs at that firm. Otherwise, students won't want to take your courses and you end up with a large problem. Now, when we're talking about not just general investments in training, but specifically investments that require the state, you have a lot of other problems that come up in institutional economics, right? So we know that the state has a monopoly on violence. It's the final arbiter of contracts, and that creates some perverse incentives for it. And so particularly if we want to think of the state as an investment partner, these incentives can be problematic. So the sort of classic Douglas North view of this is that you're afraid of expropriation. I make an investment with the state knows what I have, how much it's worth, they just take it from me later. You can also think of sort of Tim Fry's work on time and consistency problems, where the state may be willing to make an agreement with someone today, but as circumstances change, they simply change their mind. They want to then revise the contracts. And again, if the state is sort of has this monopoly on violence, it's the final arbiter of contracts, there's not a lot that you can do as a counterparty to prevent it from doing that. And the last one, the one that is most important for us here, is that when the state cannot be held accountable by the population, it also has perverse incentives to not exert more than the minimum amount of effort necessary in order to accomplish things. So here the literature on bureaucratic politics often points out that absent controls on low-level bureaucrats, they generally tend to shirk. They don't want to expend a lot of effort. They want to focus on, their leisure, on corruption, whatever it is. And the way to sort of hold them back is for the state itself to create better incentive structures. And so when we talk about public-private partnerships, right, these contracts between a firm and a school, this sort of fact that the state is now your counterparty makes all of these problems much, much harder. Because if you're a firm, the way that these work in Germany and also it turns out in Russia is that you're trading the time of your employees or actual monetary in-kind benefits for future employees that have a specific skill. If you're a school, retooling your operations, your curricula, in order to meet the needs of firms is costly. It requires you to alter your basic methods to reteach your teachers. And particularly when we're talking about Russia, you end up in this massive, totally painful experience of trying to negotiate with both regional and federal authorities so that the new training programs that you develop fit the federal government standards, right? The Gosstandarte and all these other things. And so it's a tremendous cost for both firms and schools. And so the question we have to ask ourselves is that if it's the case that firms and schools want to come to an arrangement and make these partnerships, how do the two sides keep each other honest, right? Knowing that the state has all these powers, noting that the firms have all these incentives, how do you make sure that everybody makes an agreement and keeps it? Now, traditionally, if we think about the state and its ability to credibly promise that it will keep agreements as written, the sort of traditional solution is just institutions, right? And so generally in this literature, what we mean is anything that allows for the society or elites to monitor and sanction the activities of the state. The state does something bad, it violates agreements, we find a way to punish it. And so the typical way we think about this in the literature is democracy or constitutions, but more recent work has also looked at the single party regime itself in China, for example, as a way for which, by which certain parts of society, specifically the party members, can hold the state accountable. In the bureaucratic party literature, there's also this concept of fire alarms, where you basically create the opportunity for civic society to come and yell to politicians about all of the horrible things the bureaucracy is doing. And then the politicians, knowing this, go down and start punishing bureaucrats. So this generally comes out of the literature on American bureaucratic politics. So there are many ways in which this can work. Now, if we look specifically at this literature on public-private partnerships in vocational education and training, they also suggest that the structure of the economy itself can work. And so one way this works is through markets, right? So if you have a functioning sort of Chicago school perfect market where prices are perfect information, everything's transparent, there aren't transaction costs, regardless, this whole commitment problem between firms and schools and employees will eventually sort itself out, because eventually the firms will offer enough money that the students will themselves decide to go get trained, and they'll go and they'll take the wages. If it turns out the students have the wrong skills, wages will be lowered, schools won't be able to find places for their graduates to go. A sort of alternative to this, and what we generally see in countries like Germany, where public-private partnerships are much more vibrant and much more institutionalized, is civil society itself. So in Germany, the way that these firm-school agreements are enforced is because the state works together with business associations and labor unions. And the business associations are able to monitor the work of the schools. If there's a problem with the schools, they're then able to get together and sort of lobby the government to solve those problems. Similarly, the schools can make use of the labor unions or the state itself to push back when firms aren't keeping their side of the agreements, right? And then unions are here because unions are able to defend the needs of the workers themselves. But the problem with this sort of traditional literature is you have this implicit assumption, right? We assume rule of law, contracts matter, the market works purely efficiently, there are no transaction costs, and or you have strong civil society. And so again, it raises the question, what if you have neither? What do you do? Now, our argument is that in the absence of strong civil society and strong business associations, and when the market is more problematic, it doesn't function quite as well as the Chicago school would like it to, that actually the state can take on a lot of the functions that are necessary to get the firms and the schools to come into agreement. And the reason the state can do that is because the state has the ability to link together actors, right, to find schools that need to be made relevant, that need firms to take their graduates, and firms that need highly skilled workers, and to get them into a room to talk. Similarly, the state can monitor performance, right? It can make use of its bureaucracy, its inspectors, to go in and figure out what the schools are doing, make sure they're doing what they're supposed to, and similarly to check and make sure that the firms are paying the money they're supposed to be paying, participating on the commissions they're supposed to be participating on, hiring the people they're supposed to be hiring, et cetera, et cetera. And most importantly, the state can enforce these agreements itself with its coercive capacity. Now, the issue with this, of course, is that, well, it's fine that you can get the state to do all these things, but we're back at our sort of Northian problem, right? Why would the state do these things? How can you get it to make use of these capacities? And how can you be sure that both firms and schools believe the state when it says that it's willing to do these things, right? How do we make these commitments credible in the language of institutional economics? And so here we argue that there are sort of three ways to think about this theoretically. The first one is simply, is the state able to monitor firms and schools? Do the actors actually believe that the state has the capacity to do that? And so here what we argue is that in Russia specifically, right, the administrative capacity of the regions themselves, if it's strong enough, will enable the firms to say, okay, well, if we make this agreement, we can count on our partners in the state to actually be able to go in and know what's going on and to punish schools for malfeasance And the schools can do the opposite, right? They believe that the state actually has the ability to go into firms and figure out what's going on. But again, just having this ability isn't necessarily enough, right? Because the firms and the schools have to be able to believe that the state will use this ability. And so here we look at two separate things. So the classic solution to this is political competition. So where the regional governments face more political competition, they're more willing to listen to society. It's easier for actors to lobby them or pressure them on their own behalfs. And therefore, where you have more political competition, the firms know that they can pressure the politicians if the schools don't keep agreements, and vice versa. And by here, political competition, we basically mean electoral competition, right? So if you as a firm or as a school are having trouble with your partner, the regional government isn't able to solve this problem for you, vote the bums out, find somebody that can. That's a very sort of Western classical way of viewing it. The argument that we think is more viable, to sort of spoil my own talk here, in Russia is a little bit different. So here we want to talk about access to power. Because particularly in the developing world and in hybrid regime settings, it's not always the case that political competition per se will actually produce these credible commitments. And it's particularly problematic in something like vocational education, where you have to convince voters, such as they are, that this is the most important issue they should be voting on. And so what we want to argue is that the ability of firms particularly to access power structures is actually more important. And so here we're drawing on the work of Scott Gelbach and Phil Kiefer, who argue that even in settings with weak political competition, the ability of firms or different groups on society to actually serve on legislatures enables them to pressure executive government. So Gelbach and Kiefer are mostly thinking about this in sort of the ideal type autocratic setting where the votes don't matter, there are no votes, but nonetheless there is a legislature. And the argument here is that the legislatures allow elites to coordinate with each other to punish the sort of autocratic ruler. Now, that's not what we're saying is necessarily going on in Russia, but what we do argue is that to the extent that firms are able to access the legislature and make use of friendly deputies in the legislature, this enables them to put both pressure on sort of executive authorities in the region to make sure that commitments are fulfilled. And it allows them to use those deputies to just go up to the schools, knock on doors and say, hey, you guys aren't doing what you're supposed to be doing, right? It creates a sort of pressure mechanism. And we would argue that, you know, we think about this mostly in Russia, but this should actually work in pretty much any developing country, any middle income country. And the argument that we make in this paper, although we have sort of a richer version of this argument that we develop in other papers, is that the factors that I've named above create confidence in firms that when they make an investment with the school, that investment will be honored and they'll actually get the employees that they want. And we argue that this is going to mean that firms are more willing to invest in costly forms of partnership that require them to lay out a lot of time and money, as opposed to, you know, just having career fairs and things like that, like real deep partnerships. We're also going to argue that the factors that I discussed above not only mean that firms are more likely to want to make these costly investments, but actually you should see more and more schools use them, because the schools also are able to more credibly take the commitments of firms and are more willing to engage in the reforms of their own internal structures necessary to do this. So there's sort of a supply and a demand effect that we're going to argue goes on here. Okay, sorry, let me just see how we're doing on time. Doing great. So, great theory. How do you test it? So this paper takes a sort of more aggregated view of this problem. So we're not concerned, even though our theory is developed in terms of individual schools and firms, what we want to look at is how this works on the regional level in Russia. So where is it more likely that we see more costly, innovative firms being used and more schools using those forms? So our dependent variable comes from a unique data set that we've developed from the year-end reports that are developed by all secondary vocational schools in Russia. So the way that this works is that every year, every school in Russia is required to create a report and put it on its website. I will say for the record that everybody more or less did this in 2013. They've become less diligent over time. But that being said, this paper only deals with the 2013 data because that's all that we've coded so far. And so our data set here consists of 1,600 plus schools across all Russia regions. Now, what's interesting about these reports is they're semi-structured. There's not one particular thing that schools have to do. But to the extent that these public-private partnerships are a priority of the federal government, President Putin and I guess now former Prime Minister Medvedev, back when he was the president, have both given lots and lots of speeches about this particular form, about the need to create these partnerships between firms and schools. And so the regions had every incentive to encourage their schools to be very transparent about these partnerships. And the schools themselves had every incentive to try to report every partnership that they had. Now, what's interesting about these reports is that not only do you know which firms the schools are working with, but generally they're very, very effusive about exactly what they're doing. So if they're doing simple things like praktika, which is this Russian practice of, so the closest Western analog is an internship, but it's not really an internship. And we got actually into a massive fight with the reviewer over this translation and ended up just using the Russian term in the journal, which I think would be a first for, well, maybe not a first, but it's a rarity for the European Journal of Political Economy. But regardless, right, this sort of form that generally doesn't require a lot. Like the students show up, you give them menial tasks sometimes, then you send them home. Or you just do career fairs. They also, however, tend to brag a lot when they have concrete contracts with these firms to take on their graduates after they finish school, or when the partner firms are paying for renovations of their building or equipment and these sorts of things. And so what we end up with is a firm school level data set of 33,000 plus relationships between these 1,600 firms, 1,600 schools and 30,000 firms. Now, the problem for us, which we do not solve in this paper, is taking that and doing firm school level analysis. When we started work on this paper, we had not got that far. If anybody's interested, we have some preliminary results on that, but that is not what we're doing here. What we do, though, is we coded these schools for the partnerships with the specific firms and the forms of partnership that are indicated. And specifically, we differentiate between costly forms of public-private partnerships. So here we mean guaranteed jobs, wages while training, stipends, equipment donations, capital investments, standard settings, and qualification exam evaluation. So things that either require a lot of money or a lot of time, in some cases both. And we differentiate that from sort of other forms like praktika, internships, career fairs, field trips, and festivals. So this is just to give you a sort of sense of, at the regional level, what we see, right? So we see that these sort of traditional form of praktika that are holdovers from the Soviet era are quite common. We see them in 69 of our 80 regions. And then we see less as we go down, right? So things like student stipends or student wages are much, much rarer. At the regional level, spoiler alert, if you do this at the firm level instead of the regional level, they're even rarer than that. But nonetheless, you do see firms doing these things. Now, for this paper, again, because we were not able, when we started, to marry our firm school level data set to firm level variables, we decided that we just wanted to look at sort of regional level aggregates, because we can sort of figure out which regions are leaders in the sort of public-private partnerships and which ones are laggards. And we want to see if that correlates with our theory of credible commitment. And so here we look at two dependent variables. The first is the sum of these costly forms that have been adopted by the region. So it's a 0 to 7, with you getting 1 if any school in your region has adopted at least one of those forms. And then we look at what we call diffusion, right, which is the share of schools that use one or more of these forms. And the argument here is that the regions that have more of these costly forms are sort of pioneers, are leaders in the formation of PPP and in these new forms of public-private partnerships. And the more schools that are adopting at least one of these costly forms, the more widespread that practice is across the region. Now, our dependent variables here are a little trickier, right? So if you'll remember, we're thinking specifically about regional administrative capacity, political competition, and access to power. So for regional administrative capacity, the variable that we use is the share of federal transfers in GRP. Now, the reason that we do this is because there's a huge literature in economics and in political science about state capacity. And one of the main arguments is the more of your revenue you are able to gather through taxes, through your own effort, the stronger your administrative capacity must be in order to actually go out and collect that money. Where you have easy money in the form of oil revenues or federal government that's just handing out money, you're less likely to make these investments. And in Russia, we specifically want to focus on federal transfers, both because resource revenues generally and formally accrue mostly to the federal budget and then come back down, but also because tax capacity itself in the regions is problematic because the federal agencies tend to collect most of the taxes, right? But this measure, we argue, gives you a sense of to what extent is the region dependent on its own business and resources, the things that it would need to tax, the things that it would need to support, the things that its bureaucracy would in principle need to serve in order to create sort of its own budget. I'll talk about a little bit later, but it turns out that using a couple alternatives to this gets us to more or less the same result. This is just the one that we think is most justifiable. For political competition, this is a very sort of simple measure. We argue that the higher the vote margin for the United Russia Party in a particular region, the less competition there is in that region. The argument being that where United Russia as our sort of dominant party in Russia wins by a lot, there's probably not that much political competition. The political machines are sort of well-tuned and well-oiled. They're able to get turnout to be relatively high and among the populations they need, et cetera, et cetera. Whereas where the margin's lower, there's more political competition, right? The authorities face more pressure in order to actually get support from the population, right? There's more of a sort of marginal effect of messing up in those regions. And then finally, in terms of access to power, we take a variable from our good colleague, David Zacconi, who published a piece recently in the American Political Science Review based on his dissertation, where he actually looks at the share of businessmen in regional legislatures. And here we argue that the more businessmen there are in a regional legislature, the more access business in general has to power, the more pressure business in general can bring to bear on regional governments, and therefore the more the regional governments are likely to cater to them. And again, just running through those hypotheses that I mentioned earlier, right, the higher the state capacity, the higher the accountability, the higher the access of business to power, these things should all lead to more costly forms of public-private partnerships or more schools using those forms. So this is just to give you a sense for the costly forms of the distribution, right? Most regions actually have no costly forms. Most of them have 2 or more, but this just gives you a sense of that distribution. And this shows you the percentage of schools that adopt at least one costly form. The ones on the left here are using 0. Those regions on the right that have nothing written to them, those are the ones that we have no data for. So either their schools aren't reporting or they have no schools. We can't always tell, unfortunately. But again, you can see from both of these that there's a lot of variation to be explained here. Now, in terms of our regression models, these 2 dependent variables obviously require different strategies. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but for the number of costly forms, we use a Poisson model with sandwich robust standard errors. It turns out that you get more or less the same thing if you do negative binomials. All the diagnostics look great, et cetera, et cetera. So that's not an issue. For the percentage of schools, we used what's called a fractionalized logit model, which particularly accounts for the fact that our share here will vary between 0 and 1. And we estimate this using GLM. In terms of controls, you can see them here on the screen. We basically controlled for all the usual suspects, right? So economically, GRP, FDI per capita, the share of the secondary sector, all of which are things that would potentially mean that you have more demand for vocational education. We controlled for labor market, percentage of employed college degree holders, the urban population, the share of the employed. Demographically, we look at the share of the population below the subsistence minimum. We also look at the share of ethnic Russians, which can be interpreted in so many ways and captures so many things, but is nonetheless, I think, quite important. And then finally, just as a sort of control for pluralism in the region, the extent to which business associations may matter, we couldn't find good variables for this. So what we use is this regional pluralism index, which was developed originally by Nikolai Petrov, one of our colleagues for the Carnegie Moscow Center. And then we also use distance from Moscow, which is again a relatively standard control. So these are the results. So I will say quickly that these are not the actual coefficients. These are what are called incidence rate ratios. So you subtract from 1 the coefficient that you see here, and that is what a 1% change in the independent variable will do in terms of a percentage change in the count, right? So here for share of transfers and regional GRP, we see 0.928. What that actually means is that for every additional percentage share of transfers in regional GRP, we see the number of costly forms falling by 7.2%. And obviously when the number is positive, as we see there for the share of businessmen in regional legislatures, then we see a positive effect. So the share of businessmen in regional legislatures, if that goes up by 1 percentage point, we see a 1.2 percentage point increase in the number of costly forms. Now, what's of note here is that political competition, right, this United Russia vote margin, doesn't matter at all. And this other variable here for political competition, I apologize, there's a typo earlier, that's actually the Carnegie Index of democracy in the Russian regions. So traditional political competition doesn't matter here. What does matter here is this administrative capacity and the share of businessmen in the regional legislatures. When we look at share of schools adopting these costly forms, we see a similar, although much less well identified, phenomena. So as the share of transfers in regional GRP increases, we see fewer schools adopting at least one costly form. And what's interesting for this variable is that the share of businessmen in the legislature doesn't matter for the diffusion, only the administrative capacity. So I want you guys to keep that in mind, because that's one of the sort of remaining puzzles of this paper by the end of it, and it's something I'll discuss hopefully if I have time. Now, as usual, in a good political economy seminar, we can't get away without our robustness checks. So there are a couple of obvious problems with our strategy. The main one being that this particular paper uses cross-sectional and regional data. So we can't rule out either of our major forms of endogeneity, omitted variables, or reverse causality. We also have the problem that our theory is about firms and schools, but our data is about regions, right? And so we could have an ecological inference issue. So we take a couple of approaches to dealing with this. In terms of sort of measurement validity, we look at two alternative ways of measuring administrative capacity: the share of transfers in regional revenue, and then the share of regional taxes in regional revenue. These are more traditional, but we think more problematic. And so we didn't want to defend them in our main analysis, but nonetheless, the results more or less hold exactly as you saw before. We also just introduce a slew of controls, like literally everything we or the reviewers could think of, we tossed it in. So there were these competitions to promote public-private partnerships in the regions. We controlled for that. We controlled for levels of federal transfers. We used sort of 3 different ways of getting at the industrial structure of the region and its concentration. And we also controlled for resource extraction, which here is not just oil, but also includes diamonds, platinum, all the good stuff. Again, results continue to hold. We also did sort of a mechanism check. So if our theory is true, and this is really about credible commitment and not about just generally the willingness to partner and to do things, our non-costly forms of public-private partnerships should have no relationship, so non-costly forms of public-private partnerships should have no relationship with the independent variables, right? So if we look at what happens when we try that, so here we're looking specifically at things like traditional practica, career fairs, sports festivals, things that are just of no real value in terms of training and also tend to be non-costly. We see that actually our measures don't correlate with that at all. So it's, again, it's not about capacity or access to power that just drives generally a desire to work with, for firms and schools to work together. It specifically drives a desire to work together using costly methods. Now, the one thing you may notice is that it turns out that where you get more political competition, you see less of this traditional public-private partnership usage, which is interesting. It raises a question that we don't address in this paper about, well, is it the case that some of these firms and schools aren't getting together because they want to, but because the government is forcing them to? This, I think, suggests that that does happen in some places, but again, it doesn't affect these costly forms, right? In those places, they're doing sort of more pro forma things. And we get similar results when we looked at the share of schools. So the last thing I'll say here, and then I'll go to the conclusions, is we also tried to use an instrumental variables approach to deal with sort of endogeneity more directly. This one is a little more difficult. And so that's why we didn't want to hang our hats on it on the main result. But the argument builds on literature on state capacity in the former communist countries generally and in Russia specifically. And the argument here is that where you have Soviet-era heavy industry, you don't need to actually develop strong tax capacity and state administrative capacity, because it's much easier to tax that huge Soviet-era firm than it is to go out and do an income tax and check everybody's returns and audit people and go after small businesses, et cetera. And so where you see this heavy industry, you see underinvestment in state capacity. And sort of the argument that Scott Gelbach particularly makes, but so does Easter, is that where you get less of this tax capacity over time, you get less state capacity. So the contemporary administrative capacity is affected by those path-dependent choices that were made based on the presence of Soviet industry or not. And so what we do is we get some data that was very, very kindly provided us actually by Scott Gelbach on Soviet-era industrial concentration in the regions. And we argue that this is our instrumental variable. It should be correlated with state capacity, but not with these contemporary vocational education outcomes. Now, there are 4 main ways that we argue that that could not be true, right? So what we're really relying on here is the transition itself, which breaks up the traditional economy in Russia, ruptures a lot of these firm-school relationships because the firms no longer want to pay for schools. It completely destroys large swathes of the schools themselves and of the firms, and sort of the trauma of this should break any relationship. But again, there are 4 possible, we think very plausible violations. So one is via electoral rules. This comes mostly from the Western European literature, which argues that industrial structure shapes electoral rules. Those electoral rules make you more likely to see the conditions necessary for public-private partnerships. That can't be the case in Russia because everybody's using the same electoral rules these days, more or less, right? Secondly, there's this argument that it could work through historical relationships. So in some regions, these large industrial firms create bonds with schools, which they then maintain over 22 years-ish of economic crises, political changes, et cetera, et cetera. We argue that that's unlikely. We've done a little bit of qualitative work on that. It does occasionally happen. We're not going to argue that it doesn't, but generally speaking, in the 90s, firms that had relationships with schools dumped the schools because they just did not want to spend money on them, both because they were still producing Soviet-era employees that the firms didn't need, but also because the firms had massive balance sheet problems. So these historical relationships are unlikely to persist path-dependently over time. Secondly, you can argue that access to power itself could be dependent. Again, with this idea that regions where heavy industry was important, they had a lot of influence in the Soviet era, and they continue to maintain this over time. Again, the transition broke up a lot of those, if for no other reason than the firms could now actually themselves come into power, but also the specifics of who was in charge politically, who was in the legislature, all of these things sort of shifted and changed in ways that were non-systematic in a lot of cases, or were less systematic from the point of view of this specific violation of the exclusion restriction. Just in case, though, we do control for that in our instrumental variables approach. And then the final one here is the contemporary industrial structure in the Soviet era, right? The regions that had heavy industry in the Soviet era probably have heavy industry today. It turns out that that is much less correlated than you would think, actually. It tends to not be correlated in terms of employment concentration, which is the main thing that we look at for our instrumental variables approach, mostly in terms of concentration in GRP. But nonetheless, despite the fact that the correlations here are surprisingly weak, and again, we think the transition broke a lot of this, we still control for that in the first stage. So I'm almost out of time. If anybody cares, I can show you the table, but basically what we find is that using this instrumental variables approach, our results remain robust. And we do all of the necessary diagnostics, the F-tests, et cetera, and we pass all of that with flying colors. So I will conclude and then we can move to questions. I apologize that I've gone on a little long. So we find at the end of the paper that complex, costly forms of public-private partnerships are associated with strong regional state capacity, not political competition, that's a typo as well, and firm representation in the legislatures. And the same thing is generally true about the share of schools that adopt these things. So this is consistent with our credible commitment framework. It is not proof. We will not claim that it is solid, decisive proof. But if our theory is true, this is exactly what we would see in the real world. So it suggests that there's a lot of room for future work that could be valuable here. And specifically, again, because we're assuming that commitment leads to firm confidence, and this is what leads to investment, we want to look at this at the micro level. And so our next papers make use of some original survey data that we gathered over the course of a project with the Russian National Science Foundation. As well as we were finally able to match this semi-structured firm school data to actual firm level data from Ruslana. And so we'll actually be able to look at sort of firm level correlates. But we also, in sort of thinking through this instrumental variables approach, we also realized that we need to do more work, and probably to begin with qualitative work, to examine the role of path dependency, because there is some there, and a lot of the interviews that we carried out suggest that there are elements of it, but it's not a sort of translation from the Soviet era. And so because of that, we think it's worth more thought. And again, as I mentioned briefly here, there's also this question, my colleague Tom Remington is of the philosophy that it doesn't matter if the firms and the schools are getting together at gunpoint or not, as long as they're getting together. But the role of coercion actually should be thought of, I think, quite carefully here, because it matters for the way that we sort of articulate this theory and for the sort of implications. So I will stop there and open up for questions. And I thank you very
Very
much.
good.
So I apologize if there were questions in the chat. They're not showing up in my chat.
Well, Israel, thanks very much. That's very, very interesting. I see one question in the chat column from Denis Ivanov, and the question is, why vote margin and not vote share? I don't see any other questions in the chat, but maybe you can start with this one. And in the meantime, everyone else is welcome to ask questions.
Okay.
Again, ideally by putting those questions in the chat column.
Okay. I do see Denise's question now. So
oh, you do. All right.
There's a little bit of lag here.
Yeah. Excellent.
So Denise, thank you for the question. So we use vote margin and not share because a vote share can be very misleading. So United Russia wins 56% of the vote. It wins 90% of the vote. That doesn't tell you how strong it is relative to its closest competitors. And so here, what we would argue is that a region in which United Russia gets 56% of the vote and the Communist Party gets 44 is much more politically competitive than a region where United Russia gets 56% of the vote and the Communists are the second place party, but they have like 13% of the vote, right? So the vote margin is useful here because it both gives us the strength of United Russia, but also the degree to which the opposition is fragmented. And to the extent that the opposition would be fragmented in some places, they're less able to sort of articulate what you would need in order for this political competition story to be true. That being said, I don't believe we checked the robustness to that, but based on sort of my previous work with these variables, they're pretty highly correlated. It's going to be pretty similar, particularly in 2012. 2012, the Russian electoral situation is what it is at that point. I think many of us are aware of that. Okay, so I see Georgi Tarasenko. Sorry, I'm going to read the question react. So is there a big enough variation in Soviet heavy industry development considering today's regional borders? Maybe this variation is rather intra-regional because of industrial overconcentration. It's hard for me to, I guess, react to that. I mean, just purely in the technical sense, there's a lot of variation across it. I would argue that here, though, it's capturing what we want because whether there is sort of lumpy concentration within the region or not, generally, sorry, let me rephrase. So our precise measure here is a Herfindahl index of employment concentration. And so I would argue that even if there is a lot of variation within the region, generally regions where you have a higher level of employment concentration, most of that employment concentration in industry is going to be in a couple of workplaces. So really what this measurement is capturing at a sort of more fine-grained level is, do you have like avtovaz in your region, right? Like, do you have these massive industrial extractive industries or these massive industrial heavy industrial production plants. And so I think that here, yes, the intra-region variation may matter, but particularly if what we care about is the regional level variation, the main thing we want to focus on is sort of the region as a whole. And again, the way that theory works is if you have one very large factory with immobile assets that's easy to tax, lots of employees, you can have an inspector sit there and see what's coming off the line. That's when you underinvest. And so I guess to complete my answer, it's hard for me to tell you. So I understand your point. I'm not sure that it would necessarily be a problem here. I will say, though, to your broader point about a lower level analysis telling us more, I absolutely agree, right? So it is not an accident that I mentioned that we're doing more micro level study. The point that you make here is valuable, but I would argue that it's also important, again, from this sort of ecological inference standpoint of our theory is about concrete individual firms and schools, not about regions per se, although it has implications for regions. That being said, thank you for the point. Again, if there's interest, you can email me. I have a working paper version where I try to look at this at the regional level. It's harder to get administrative capacity at the lower municipal level. So I'd be curious if you have specific suggestions about that, because that's something we would definitely want to do. I will say, I guess, this is another paper, another project, but we do have some work on surveys where we do try to assess what firms think of the capacity of their municipal authorities, which is much closer, I think, to what you mean, and probably closer to the level you would need for our theory. And we do find correlations there as well. So different form of data. Okay. I see Vice Rector David has a question as well. So I have a question for general understanding. Does the support matter for the schools? Can we say something about the impact of this help for schools? That's an excellent question. Here I would say two things. So, and this is less about this paper, it more comes from the qualitative work that we did. So we did case studies of 6 regions where we actually went out and we interviewed firms and schools as well as regional authorities. So from that project, we do find that the support matters, and the support matters in sort of 2 ways. So one way it matters is that for the schools, even though they're getting their money from the number of students, right? That's how they get their budżetny miast, and that's what sort of pays their budget. The less people think that graduating from that school get them a job, the fewer students they get. So for them, it's very important to be able to credibly provide training and credibly provide jobs. And so here, for the schools, it's incredibly valuable to have these firm partners, because generally what you do is not just say like, hey, we have firm partners, like so like in Kaluga, for example, right? Volkswagen has a partnership with the school, and they're like Volkswagen instructors who come into the school and teach part of the day. That one's a particularly sort of a particular case of costly forms, because then the students actually go to the Volkswagen plants to train as well. But even in places where that doesn't happen, right, the firms have presence at these schools. They're on the kwalifikacyjnej komisji, they're making the tests, they're providing instructors. And so like there's a visible commitment from the standpoint of the students that, yes, actually this firm cares. Yes, actually this firm is doing things with the school. This school is somewhere I'd want to spend time. And then secondly, like the other form of aid here that we see quite often is that the firms pay for building renovations and equipment, right? And so purely from the standpoint of having, you know, like a building that's not falling apart, these things are actually quite valuable materially speaking. Now, the bigger question, I think, for Russian policymakers, and the one that we as political scientists are not equipped to handle, we're hoping our colleagues at the Instytut Obrazowania will, is whether ultimately these forms result in what we care about, which is not just partnerships, but actual uptake of qualified workers. We do not yet have an answer to that. Part of the reason for this is when we started this project, we only had the 2013 data. These things had only started in 2013, and so it wasn't possible to really measure it. But we've been collecting this data. We now have a time series through last year. We also have started to potentially be able to gather data on the actual graduates, and so we can assess the more important policy-making questions now, I think. But the sort of first-order problem is, if we think these things matter, as studies have shown they do in other countries, how do you get them in the first place, right? Because that's sort of the first-order problem. Okay, I apologize. I'm going to try to go quickly. So Bernardo Pincheira, I hope I pronounced your name correctly. I did that in a sort of very Portuguese Brazilian style, which is my native language.
Almost correct, no worries.
I'm sorry?
Almost correct.
Okay, sorry. The first clarification, what was the meaning interpretation of the main coefficients? So the main coefficients are IRR, right? So incidence rate ratios. So subtract the coefficient from, let's see, hold on, let me go back. So you subtract the coefficient from 1. The result is how the percentage change in the independent variable affects the dependent variable, right? So less than 1 means it's negative, more than 1 means it's positive. And I believe the GLM was like odds ratios or something like that. So it's interpreted very similarly. So that was the clarification. The numbers in parentheses are the standard errors, right? So obviously here you don't try to do the math in your head because these aren't the correct coefficients. They're sort of E-formed into these IRR into this IRR form.
Yeah, that's a bit
So what you look at for the significance is the stars, right? So it's the standard 1 star is 0.9, 2 stars is 9.5, 3 stars is 0.99.
And I was a bit puzzled because when I saw the coefficient and then the standard error like didn't make sense.
Yeah, yeah, I apologize for that. So I mean, this is I tried to write this in the title, and I apologize for going fast. It's just that from my past experience, if you show the coefficient doesn't mean much, and so people always ask you, well, what does that mean in the real world? But yeah, so I apologize for that. So if I can, your second question. Do you think it's possible to implement something similar in general education? So I should state for the record, this is general education, right? These are secondary schools. So this is the Western equivalent of like middle school, high school level.
It was like mostly vocational schools, not like all.
Well, but keeping in mind that when we talk about vocational schools, right, we don't mean vocational in the sense of associate degrees. So 2-year post-high school degrees that you see in the United States. This is very much on the German model where people are actually going here instead of quote unquote academic high schools that would then track them into universities. Although I will state for the record that in Russia, it's important to keep in mind that vocational education happens at different levels. So it used to be that you could get it at like научное профессиональное образование. So this is at like the sort of elementary-ish school level. That no longer exists. It was abolished, folded into other things. But you still have sort of secondary school vocational education, and then you have vocational education for higher education, which is these sort of 2-year degrees. That's an interesting subject. We don't have good data on it, so that's not what we're talking about here. So in terms of the partnerships that develop, what we generally see, depending on the region, is sort of the ideal type of this. You spend half your time in the firm, and you spend half your time at the school, particularly in your last year. And so it's just literally a dual, so in the sort of way this is thought of in English, but in German as well, is dual education, right? Dual in the firm and in the school. So where that doesn't happen, because it's particularly hard to organize, particularly given the stringencies of Russian educational rules, regulations, and laws, which all of us at the higher school are well aware of anytime we try to do a образовательный program. What you tend to find is not internships per se, but like training trips where people will spend like anywhere from like a month to 2 months or 3 months at the firm or at the firm part-time. It really depends. There's a lot of variation on this that we know of from our qualitative and survey-based data. Unfortunately, this particular data set will not get us at that level of granularity. I had a student suggest trying to ram this stuff through automated text analysis, not necessarily to give us concrete numbers, but to try to use the language to figure out like where people are sort of spending more and less time and where things are more or less important. But you know, at this point, we just can't assess that other than through these sort of other means. So finally, I see that Denis Ivanov had another question, which is how are schools incentivized to cooperate with firms? So I sort of answered that when I spoke to Vice Rector Yukiewicz's question, which is that for the schools themselves, it's helpful to have these partnerships in order to maintain relevancy, in order to get students. Because one of the main stories of Russian vocational education over, well, the last 30 years, because the trend continues even to now, is that the share of students going to these schools and the number of students they have is declining. And particularly given that your budget is tied to your students and the number of students you have a strong incentive to put more bodies in the school. And again, one way to do this is to actually offer the students a product, offer them something that's valuable. And one way to do that is through these firm-school cooperations, particularly if you can get the firm to shoulder a lot of the burden in terms of telling you what you need to teach, how you need to teach it, providing you equipment, in some cases paying your instructors, training your instructors, et cetera, et cetera. I would also note, and this comes from our qualitative work, you also see in some regions pressure from the governor, specifically because, again, as I mentioned earlier, the development of dual education with Russian peculiarities is, I guess, how we would try to translate that, is something that Medvedev and I don't know what his title is anymore. So I guess former President, Prime Minister Medvedev, and President Putin have been discussing for a long time. And you actually see that in the same way that our Honorable Mayor Sobyanin is getting out in front and showing how he is sort of a technocratic leader in the sphere of COVID relief, and he's using this to raise his profile. You saw similar things in the 2012, 2013, 2014, with people like Kaluga's government, or Kaluga's governor, or the governor of Belgorod, where they also had incentives to try to create their own policy expertise. But in order to do that, you obviously have to get your region to do things. That's something that, again, we couldn't take account of in this study, but we found was quite important in our qualitative work, which if anybody's interested in, I can pass it to you. There's also a paper that was just published in Europe-Asia Studies on that. So are there any more questions? Anything else I can try to say to clarify?
We can hear you.
Yeah, okay. Well, sorry about that, guys. Yes, thanks very much, Das. I would like to make a comment, ask a question if there is no one else. The first one is about terminology. You said you were searching for a good Russian English translation of practica. So what immediately comes to my mind is apprenticeship. So perhaps apprenticeship might be a better term for what you're searching, but that's really an aside. Somewhat more importantly, I'm not sure if the term public-private partnership is appropriate for what you discuss, because the conventional meaning of public-private partnership is about some relations between government agencies and private firms, such as outsourcing of public services or construction projects, so on and so forth. In the case of these relations between vocational schools and firms, it's not a priori clear what is public, what is private. I understand you assume that most of the schools are public, and that's true, but conceivably, schools can be private, and on the other side, firms can very much be public, increasingly the case in Russia. But this is not very important, of course. Perhaps more significantly, I would like to challenge your interpretation of the main empirical finding, and that is, well, it's very good that you have this slide on display. You argue that a greater share of federal transfers in the regional GRP implies lesser partnerships between schools and firms. And you say that this is because in that case, you see lesser involvement of regional governments in upholding these partnerships, and I take that point. But the explanation as to why greater share of federal transfers implies lesser state involvement, you argue this is because of the regional state capacity, but I would like to offer an alternative explanation, and this is because of the weaker incentives for regional governments to get involved in this area, and for that matter in anything that supports private sector, because if you have this manna in terms of federal transfers, Chechnya as an example, why bother to, to exercise costly efforts to accumulate human capital, so on and so forth. So can you differentiate between two possible mechanisms? One is the capacity to uphold this partnership, and the other one, the incentives to uphold this partnership, which might or might not be related to capacity per se.
Sure, give me just a second. Actually, okay. Sorry, I just, so these are very good points. And it's literally you're paraphrasing one of our reviewers, actually,
Yeah,
on this latter problem.
Sure.
So,
I was not the reviewer. I go for the record. Okay.
I assume not. Because he then proceeded to ask us all kinds of super technical questions and about like it was not to disparage you, but it's just I can imagine the sorts of comments that you would have made as a reviewer, and these were like clearly you know an economist's point of view.
Never mind.
So
Right.
let me. So I agree with you that the PPP issue is maybe not the central one, but I think it's an interesting and important one. So I would say two things to that. So one, from the standpoint of the schools, we're pretty sure they're all public because the way that we collected this отчетности, it all comes through the regional governments. So whether they're formally private or not, they're receiving huge shares of public monies, and the regional governments are sort of naming them as public. From the standpoint of the firms, though, you're absolutely right. So one of the things that we want to do with this firm level data is specifically to see if all of this is really a story of state-owned firms, partially state-owned firms, golden share firms, these sorts of things that are participating in these relationships to look good, or if it's, again, about this sort of credible commitment story that we've developed. I think that's an incredibly potent point, and it's one that we can't really deal with here. The reason that we originally chose this public-private partnership terminology is that when we look at most of these relationships in Russia, most of them, at least in the period that we started in, were actually underlined by contracts, like by real contracts between firms and schools, where, you know, the school will do A, B, C, D, E, F, G, and the firm will do other things. And for some regions, we actually have the text of those contracts. So we know what was being offered and where. The problem is, from the standpoint of using that, A, it's not clear that ethically we can, because it's not clear we were supposed to get that. B, the samples were completely non-random. So trying to do any sort of systematic analysis other than to say, like, we have contracts, here are a couple things that people are doing, was not really possible. But to the extent that these are public-private contracts, like, to the extent that there are contracts involved, that's why we thought this terminology was useful. Although you're right that that's not the way that, particularly in public administration, people would think of it. This is us being controversial, I suppose. The more, I think, interesting question that you asked us is specifically, I mean, if I can rephrase it slightly, assuming I understood it correctly, what you're really getting at here is the moral hazard problem, right? The fact that not only is it the case that some regions don't want to invest in human and social capital, having gotten federal money, they want to continue to do badly, right? So it's not that they have government transfers and therefore their capacity is bad. It's that they never wanted to invest in that in the first place, and therefore they're getting the transfers, right? Which I think is an incredibly important and powerful point. And you're absolutely right that this is an alternative mechanism. So we try to get around this in sort of two ways. And I fully agree that it's not necessarily the most satisfying, but we believe that it's the one that's most consistent with the evidence. So first, we would argue that the roots of this moral hazard problem are deeper historically, right? So Chechnya develops the way it does. They're willing to, or they want more money from the federal government because they historically didn't have the things necessary to produce sort of a strong industrialized economy. And so because these things are historically rooted, right? And I would note, by the way, that Chechnya is not and neither basically any of the Kavkazskие Respubliki in this data set, because we just don't have controls for some of them for this period. But if you imagine the same problem applies to other to other Russian regions, because the state capacity has these historical roots, And because we try to deal with that through this instrumental variable, we think that what we're measuring is in fact about this underinvestment in capacity and not the moral hazard per se. That being said, we would also argue that these two things reinforce each other. So even if it's the case that it's not about capacity, it's about the moral hazard, the two can't really easily be separated, because wherever you have the moral hazard, you have the underinvestment. And wherever you have the underinvestment, you have the moral hazard. So even though theoretically there's something to be taken there, functionally, from the standpoint of sort of our theory of what firms are doing, you end up in the same results. The trick, and the reason that we would like to think more about this and to try to find a way to untangle it, which is why we really want to think about these path-dependent relationships, is the policy prescriptions. Because the things that, so, you know, from the standpoint of particularly Tom Remington, he's spending his retirement trying to, you know, think about inequality. And for him, the reason this project matters is because this is potentially a way to deal with inequality. But if you want to do that, you need to actually be able to go and write a policy memo, say you need to do A, B, C, and D. And so obviously, the way in which you suggest that you get rid of moral hazard is very different than the way that you suggest that people just invest in their capacity, right? And so I agree with you that it's important substantively and theoretically, even though at least from the standpoint of this particular paper, they sort of go together.
Okay, well, thanks.
Fully satisfying, but
no, we can leave it at this. Thanks very much for clarifying this. We're almost out of time, but let me see if there are any other questions and comments. I don't see any. Well, in that case, Israel, thanks once again for very thought-provoking presentation. Stas, can you please remind us what's coming next?
Yep. Next week we are having the presentation by Maria Padilla Roma. She's from the University of Tennessee, and she's gonna talk about the crime and short-term shocks to student cognition and secondary consequences.
All right, excellent. Make sure you don't miss this one. Well, thanks very much, everyone. As always, be safe, keep social distancing, and I very much hope to see all of you again in about a week. Israel, thanks a lot. Take care.
Thank you for the invitation. I was happy to speak with you all.